So, welcome today.
Yeah.
I'm Amy Blossom, and I'm here with Stories of Southern Oregon, talking to people about their views of Ashland and how you've seen changes. And I would like you to introduce yourself to the camera.
Okay, so I'm Kit Leary, or Kathleen F. Leary. My name is on the book. I'm co-author of that. And I came to the Valley in 1985.
Same year I did.
Yeah, actually the same year. And Amy and I actually met at the Ashland Library or at Medford Library, because I was also working there some and also volunteering for a while too. So anyway, that's how we met.
Mm-hmm. Both retired librarians.
Yeah.
Only your specialty was archives.
Mm-hmm.
And,
I have a library degree, but a subset also of the library program at the University of Wisconsin in Madison was an archives training program. And actually Bob is also a graduate of the University of Wisconsin too. Bob Wilson, who had been in charge of the library at the time I moved here. And he actually had me help as a volunteer early on in the local history clippings, which were in the office in the back behind the reference desk. And I heard about Terry Skibby's photos early too, so that was helpful as well in my job at OSF ultimately. Yeah. So, and I'd also worked at the Southern Oregon Historical Society when it was based in Jacksonville originally, and they also had kind of a small collection, but they had information about OSF also. So I had worked at all those places, and I subbed on the reference desk. I think it was 9 years or so.
at the public library.
At the public library, at the Ashland Library, because when I first worked at the Shakespeare Festival, I was only 25 hours a week at the beginning, and so, as is the case with a lot of people in the Valley, you kind of fill in and have multiple jobs where you can get the jobs. And
sure.
So, yeah, so I kind of drew on all that information I had at the outset. I had moved here from Ohio, and so I spent about the first several months kind of reading on Golden Fire and Angus's book, and there was a PhD dissertation. A guy named Bill Euler had gone to the I think it was UCLA, and he had interviewed Angus and had information about the festival all the way up to 1970 when the Bomer opened. And so I read a lot in the first few months when I was working there. And actually I was hired by Peggy Rubin also, who had been an actor in the late 50s, actually at the time of the big fire. I think it was 59. Mm-hmm. And she was on stage. She and Shirley Patton were both on stage, and they could see the flames up in the hills. And I think it was Antony and Cleopatra that they were in. And anyway, but Peggy had hired me. But one of the things I found, I think it was in Terry Skibby's collection, at the library was a picture of the boxing matches. And I got a copy from Terry and took it over to show Peggy, and she just thought that was just something they had talked about. It wasn't actually had happened. And I mean, but I also found out newspaper clippings and other things like that also too, so I convinced her that it really did happen. So
the archives, I think, were they first organized by Kay Atwood?
Uh-huh.
But were you the first archivist that was hired?
No, but Kay had gotten a bicentennial grant at the time of the the initial exhibit center was in the Swedenborg House on the SOU campus, on the corner of the campus there. And Kay and another guy who I think was a carpenter, I forget his name now, but anyway, they were assigned to develop this exhibit in the Swedenborg House and to tell the story of the festival in Ashland. And so she got this bicentennial grant, of course, 1976. And so that was kind of the first inkling of an archives. I know too, Bill Patton had kept newspaper clippings ever since he had begun in 1953 as the first full-time employee who was paid. And the Tudor Guild helped later to get a bunch of scholarships in order to pay the people. But he had a bunch of newspaper clippings, so that gave me
a basis.
So other information.
You were the archivist at OSF for 26 years?
I left in June 2011.
Mm-hmm. And how did you find, were the archives, I know it was originally developed with papers and different things you got from different departments, and then your memory, which was a huge resource in the archives. How did you find the archives were used by the public or at all, or was it mostly staff?
Well, obviously, being a theater, there were the newspapers and also the TV stations who had articles or stories, especially an opening weekend. They'd say the show was opening and all this, and they'd have a little thing on the TV. But over the years too, because even at the time I came, it was quite a few years later that they actually had any kind of paid advertising, and so they kind of relied on the newspapers and the TV stations to get the word out about OSF in this little town and all that. But and in the late 30s, they'd gone to the Golden Gate Exposition on the island in the bay off of San Francisco, and there was an NBC radio recording that went nationwide at that time. And then in the 50s, there were later NBC radio recordings of the plays too, and later KSOR also in the 80s, I think they did some of the recordings of the plays. And so they were using all sorts of things in order to get the word out about Shakespeare out in the boonies. and and Angus also in I forget exactly. I think it was the Diamond Jubilee of the state of Oregon, and the governor at that time had asked him to do like a cavalcade of, and it was I think it was close to where Harry and David Field is now, and they had a bunch of, I don't know, like wagon trains and all sorts of things, and there were actors from the community. There were a few of the early actors also operated a bunch of businesses, and there were I mean, an early actor too was Eugene Bennett, who was an artist, but also the president of the college here had been on the board, and he actually helped to build some of the benches in the outdoor theater because they didn't have seating, and it was a real community effort. And
do you feel that, excuse me, but I
Sure.
like that idea of the community effort. How did you see that? Did you see that changing over the many years that you were working for OSF and being in the community? Everybody sort of rallying around OSF, and the crowds getting bigger and more, coming from farther places and things like that. How did you see all that evolve?
I mean, well, of course, there's a huge core of volunteers, and even the actors were volunteers until actually Actors Equity came in officially, like, I think it was 84 or 85, but like in 59 there were still, it was, I think at the beginning, and as I say, the Tutor Guild helped to have scholarships in order to help to pay the actors, but the actors were also, they worked at the lumber yard, or and they helped in the orchards and other places like that, also, just to have some extra money. But I mean, even hanging of the banners, and of course also the city of Ashland also owned a lot of the buildings too, and so it was a lease, and actually the lease on a lot of the buildings still exists to this day. And also, and I found this at the time that they were building the parking structure and also the new theater. I found that I had the only copy of the National Register of the Lithia Park, and the Elizabethan is on Lithia Park land. It was done by Rod Reed, and because his wife Susan Reed was on the city council at the time, and so of course the city had to approve some of the things that OSF had to do, and she happened to mention that in a city council meeting, and I knew that I had some information
In the
archives, and so I looked and I found out that I had the only copy of the National Register nomination. The Southern Oregon Historical Society didn't even have a copy of it, and anyway, over the years too, I had worked, because Kay Atwood later on had helped in the city archives. I think it was under the, I think it was under either the city recorder or treasurer office or something. And so she also came to the OSF archives at one point also to find information about OSF and the city connection, because somebody had asked her to develop that. So she created these notebooks full of newspaper clippings about how OSF had done other things too. But in addition to that, there were people hanging the banners, and
so a lot of close connection between OSF and the city. And did you see that continuing to grow or separate more with the union coming in saying maybe union people shouldn't be hanging banners?
Oh, I mean, it was, for a while there were, even in the 50s, George Peppard was an actor who at the end of the season they were trying to break down the lights and all that, and he said he didn't want to do that because he was an actor. He'd gone to Yale, and he thought that was beneath him. But even in the 70s, I know I heard about some actors who were up on the big light poles in the outdoor theater there, and they were helping to get the lights down and all that. So that wasn't, I mean, that was kind of a given. And in those days too, there were understudies, but there were also multiple. There were 3 or 4 shows that people were in at the same time, and even at one point there was somebody, I forget who, but there was somebody who had been in a show in the Bomer early in the production, and then he ran across the street and was in a show in the Black Swan later on in the play that was there. So they were doing a lot of things. And
did you find that there was a lot of support from the city for what was going on at OSF?
Oh, sure. In part because board members had included a lot of the business people. In fact, Angus had been in a men's club. I forget the name of it, but it was like the Elks or something like that. Or the Lions, of course, did the Feast of Will for years and years. Also, but SOU, Angus was a teacher at SOU too, beginning in 1931. And so, and a part of the reason he was interested in establishing the Shakespeare Festival was because at SOU they didn't really have a good theater space, and they were, I don't know, they had like an area that had a hallway, and they'd kind of open the doors, and that would be a part of like the theater set almost, and he saw the Chautauqua after the roof had fallen in, and there were kids in town who were hanging off the rafters and going like, I don't know, Tarzan, on the ropes and all that, and everybody thought it was a big hazard, so they tore down the roof, I think in 1931, and Angus happened to be up on the hill, like maybe at the top of Fork or someplace like that, and he noticed that it looked like an Elizabethan theater, and another thing too that helped out there was that, I mean it was later on in the late 40s, Bill Patton had been a roommate to Richard Hay, and so he got him to come up after college. I think that Bill had grown up in Medford, and then had gone down to school in Stanford. And so, but there was a connection of a lot of education entities around the country too, but SOU was very involved too, and there were people, it even happens now, that a lot of the faculty members at SOU had worked at one point at OSF, and of course at the high school too. They have, I think it's over 25 years now that they've had assistants there. But even in the early 30s, there was a guy, I forget exactly which one it is, but he was a teacher at I think at the Medford High School, and of course they split into South and North that time too. But then also in 1970, after the Bomer opened, they started having a bunch of student matinees. Originally in the month of September, they were all completely student matinees, or seniors could come at a discounted rate at that time. And then they began the school visit program too, which has, and the school tours around, and they're teams of 2 actors that go out in the off season, and they went, over the years they've been out to Hawaii, and I think there were 2 or 3 teams that went up to Alaska at one point. And
so a lot of outreach going on.
Yeah.
So you probably saw a lot of changes from the small regional theater where the actors did everything to all of a sudden the growth, and particularly when the Bomer opened with an extra 650 seats every time.
Well, although even earlier, there was a theater that I think there were a couple of people that were connected to SOU too, which at the time it was Southern Oregon College or Southern Oregon State College, who had a theater kind of kitty corner from the I'll call it the Mark Antony.
Yeah.
But anyway, in the area where the bank is now, it had been a theater that burned.
Right, Bernard. That one?
No, that was a block down across from Wells Fargo. But anyway, it was the Vining Repertory.
Oh, yes.
And so that was in the 1950s even, that Angus and other townspeople in the off season, because the Shakespeare Festival was only in the summer at that time, and they put on plays. I think it was the Lithia Theater at the Vining Rep, or excuse me, the reverse of that, the Vining Repertory at the Lithia Theater, and so they did modern day plays. Also, as I happen to think of it, the Holly, in 1939, Angus directed You Can't Take It With You, and it was the West Coast premiere at the Holly in 1939. But as I say, the Vining Repertory was in the off season, so they did modern plays. But then at the Varsity too, in the early 60s, before they had the Bomer opening, they had, and at the Varsity it was all a single theater at that time. It hadn't actually been broken up into the different movie venues now. And so they had these ballad operas, and that attracted quite an audience too. So they developed and of course they always had a 4th of July entry, in part because OSF had begun on the 4th of July weekend in 1935. And so they always made a big deal of the 4th of July entries. Now, it doesn't happen every year these days, and in part because they're so busy, because it was always a volunteer effort, and also a show opens right around the 4th of July weekend,
Right.
and so they don't have a day off on the 4th of July, which is a holiday for all of us. They have shows because they began on the 4th of July. So they're doing shows. And so it had taken on
Well, and with so then having free theaters, I mean, what a change. I'm thinking of more of contemporary times.
Sure.
What changes you're aware of from?
Sure. Well, of course, it was in 1977 that the Black Swan opened, and in part it was because of actors who were doing these midnight shows where they wanted to do like I don't know, Sam Shepard or something like that. So they'd have these shows after the regular play that they were in had closed for the evening. Then they went over and they did their own project that they wanted to do. So they had these midnight projects. Well, it got so popular that they just decided, let's open it as a third venue. And so they did that, and that went until 2002, when the new theater, now called the Thomas, opened. And of course, and when I moved here, there was a parking lot there. And so at the time, they decided they needed to have another theater there. They had to go to the city and get approvals, and there was a big, well, hoopla about the parking garage and if it would be free. It was, I mean, city owned, but I mean, because I forget if there were ever parking meters in the area. I know they put on in the parking lot down the hill, the corner of Pioneer. They had a 4-hour only for a long time, but only, I mean, except in evenings and weekends if there wasn't a play or something like that. But and so there was limited parking, and at one point too, before the expansion of the Bard's Inn and then that other Plaza.
No, Plaza Suites.
Yeah, that was open because that had been an old had been a warehouse for the orchards, and at one point the OSF Endowment also bought that in case they had wanted to have another theater there at one point. And the endowment actually sold it at the time OSF expanded up to Portland, but then people were saying, oh, make that a parking lot and all that. It ended up not being a parking lot either there because, of course, it ended up as the hotel. But, you know, Ashlands always had a lot to say about everything in town, and I know at one point or another, along the way in my time here. There were, I mean, I know, when I first came, there were empty shops that couldn't make it in the off season, or they'd move farther away from the plaza, in part because the rents were less. But you could really tell the difference in the off season if the tourists weren't coming. And of course, people don't go out of business anymore, mostly since they, I mean, unless they're actually closing because they're going to retire. But I mean, until the smoke came, and that affected some tourism. But Ashland had really grown over the years, and also the I mean, even the Ashland New Plays Festival that had begun as play readings originally, which were begun by OSF, and then they got to be just regular things. So that kind of spun off also. But and over the years too, a lot of the small theaters were in town too, and had there were people who worked in the costume shop who'd be involved in the costume at those other theaters too, and you know, so there was a lot of mix and match.
There seems to be a lot of support from various OSF members helping the smaller theaters or the high school. You know, I'll see that one of the actors is directing the high school play. I know there's a lot of close connection with SOU theater department, which has really helped the university and you know, attracted people to come here. So there's such a direct correlation between OSF and the rest of the town.
And even at the time that I was working there, though, at the very beginning, SOU also had internships, and or a few work study students, and so there were people like, there's a lady who still works in the costume shop, I think, who began in the archives as a work study student. And I had art majors and others also that who would come help me too. But
well, what a gift to have this world-class theater, and you know, share their talents and you know, develop a lot of our community members. You know, we have people who have become playwrights who are now writing plays for OSF, and actors who have come up through the town system.
And even a few actors also have turned into playwrights and had some of their offerings available as play readings. Some have gotten into the New Plays Festival also too, but
and a lot of it is documented in the archives that you helped develop.
And
I just want to mention that it's great that you can go online now and see a lot of those documents have been scanned so that you can see. Let's see, the archives are online through the OSF website, and you can see a lot of the documents that you help preserve and others.
Yes, and in the last few years too, there's been a National Endowment for the Humanities that offered a grant that I first heard about in the late 90s, that there were grants available when I was going to the national meetings of Society of American Archivists, or to the Theater Library Association or something like that. And there's an Association of Theater Researchers also. And so And so there were people from all over the country who were faculty, but that's also the places that a lot of our actors came from. And so, and so that's part of how OSF kind of became, I don't know, nationally known, but Angus Bomer also served on the very first National Endowment for the Arts that began in LBJ's administration, and he got invited to the ranch in Texas, and he also was one of the OSF as a recipient, I think, got the first Ford Foundation grant, and he was really a mover and shaker in the regional theater movement as well. It just has evolved. Angus's teacher, who was Marjorie Bailey, down at Stanford, also came up here in the summers to run the education programs, and her collection is now at the SOU library also of a lot of Shakespeare, a lot of the copies of the plays, and there are a few first folios and
quite a collection.
And other things that are very rare, and originally that was at the Ashland Public Library down in the basement too.
But
so,
not very well used. And, so it was wonderful when SOU took that over, and they had a whole glassed-in area so it could be preserved better, rather than the basement that used to flood all the time.
Right. Yeah.
I think it's interesting, the evolution of archives, and I worked at Summit University of Illinois, I told you before, but it was all about paper and keeping paper and not getting tape on it or staples and things, trying to preserve paper, and now it's moved to digitization. But what they can't digitize is what's up there. You're an archive of itself with all.
Although the other thing is too, is as I mentioned, there were early NBC and KSLR and all that.
There, right? They've got that.
Yes, yes. But the other thing is too is that they got a man who had been on Tom McCall's governor's staff, who had been a radio man also, and he also taught Pat Patton in college, and got him to come to be the PR person, and because he had radio connections, he also got, it was one of the TV stations in Medford to help on the TV and the recordings and all that. So there's a ton of audiovisual collection also, and all that got transferred to modern media in the grant program. A
lot of that's listed on their website.
Yes, and after about the time I was leaving, there was a consultant who came in also, and I had interns for a few years, but then they began the FAIR program also, which is fellowships and residencies, internships, and others, and so anyway, it's been an educational institution, and it helps all around the community in multiple ways. SOU, the library,
it does. We are so
Historical Society.
To have this relationship and to have all the knowledge that you have and sharing it with us today. So thank you so much for that.
Sure.
Really appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you. Oh, well, yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much.